Good afternoon. Let's start. Thank you for coming up and welcome to this conference on the state and culture in Cuba and new cultural politics in contemporary Cuba. I'm Rafael Rojas and I'm glad to be back at the Bildner Center. This afternoon we'll try to understand that relationship between state and culture, that borderland. I think this is one of the most important issues in the Cuban studies today. We'll try to understand also how that borderland between state and culture is becoming more complex and challenging after the last economic reform. I think in Cuba today, the state and the culture both are changing, and we'll see in these papers. Let me introduce our panelists. We'll listen in the first phase, Laurie Frederik. She will speak on the theater. I think it's important to see that those two cultural activities, theater and visual arts, are cultural activities with a strong tradition of openness and criticism and autonomy, also not only in the island, but also in the Cuban diaspora. We'll listen. Laurie Frederik. Frederik is Associate Professor of Performance Studies and Anthropology at the University of Maryland. She is the author of the Trumpets in the Mountains, Theater and the Politics of National Culture in Cuba. Please, Laurie.
And I will. First off, actually, let me time myself because I am going to be speaking a little bit spontaneously. I want to thank very much the Bildner Center for inviting me. And Wilfrido, where did he go? I saw him somewhere. And Mauricio Font, thank you very much for having me here. I've been at the University of Maryland for 6 years, and I've been wanting to come up to one of these events for a long time, but it's been very busy. So I'm honored to be. I'm honored to be here. Thank you very much. When they asked me to talk about culture and state, and by the way, I'm going to be presenting in English, pero si tiene preguntas en español, después también yo puedo responder así. Okay, para los dos grupos. When I was asked to talk about culture and state, I mean, I've been working in Cuba, and I'll tell you about my research there. For me, culture and state are not two entities between which there is a boundary. Especially, I think, and all of you working in Cuba and about Cuba for many years are seeing the complexity, and the complexity is the thing that erases the boundary, and that's what makes Cuba so fascinating, as well as most other countries that we might be studying. And I also think it was really interesting to try to think about how I was going to focus my talk, because I have written a book about it, and so focusing something into 10 minutes is always a challenge for academics who like to talk a lot about their research. But I work at a state institution. I'm at the University of Maryland. And so a lot of my reflections on what state and culture and state and art are today are different 6 years after being at the University of Maryland than they were perhaps when I began, after I had just come from Cuba. So a little bit of my background. My BA, my MA, and my PhD are in cultural anthropology. But right now I am a professor of performance studies. And the reason for that is because I was, my MA was in the University of Cape Town in South Africa. And I was very interested in social movements, and I just happened to be a teatrista on the side, an artist and a dancer. And so my interest in social movements and protests through art came together inadvertently, kind of accidentally. And there's where I began my work in theater and the power of theater and how it is used both by the state and also by the people, and what happens in that negotiation, and what happens in that process of artistic creation. I'm very interested, and I have been very interested regardless of the thing that I'm looking at, in story and in narrative, and how people tell their own stories, whether that be of politics or identity or economics or anything else. So theater has been the thing that I have been looking at national narratives through, but because I'm an anthropologist, I'm more interested in the teatristas than I am la obra, than I am the play. So that will probably come out as I talk a little bit about my work. I set this first slide up here because I want to take you out of the conventional theater. I did do some work in Havana, but most of my work was done in places called zonas de silencio, or zones of silence in the mountains, working with groups that were traveling through very rural areas. So this is the backdrop for what I'm about to talk about. My research as an anthropologist are done in phases, just so you can kind of see the different, the longitudinal sort of study that I have done. 1997 to 98, I spent mostly in Havana with some trips to Santa Clara, Matanza, and other places to get to know the country and also the theater scene, and I saw as much theater and performance as I could, and I was also taking classes periodically at the at ISA, the Instituto Superior del Arte. So I was getting to know the educational system and also the professional theater around the areas. In 1998 to 2001, I was living in Cuba full-time. I had my carnet de identidad, and I was doing my fieldwork as an anthropologist. In 2001, I went with one of the groups to Europe on their first European tour, and there's a whole chapter basically dedicated to what happens when these rural teatristas go to Europe for the first time. In 2001 to 2009, I've gone back to Cuba periodically for follow-up trips to keep track of the groups that I've been working on. In 2010, I had a baby, so that explains the moment, the 3 years that I have not gone. And I'm actually going back in 2 weeks to the Festival of Theater, and I will be presenting my book at that festival. So at that point, I'm bringing my research back to the people, to my informants, to the people that I was working with. And that will then continue on the dialogue that was started over a decade ago. And that's part of the research process of an anthropologist, which I'll explain in a second. So one important thing about theater that I think is very powerful and that I've been studying for a very long time, both in South Africa and in Cuba and Latin America, is liveness. And this is going to be different, and I think we'll have some other discussion about different forms of art and representation. But in theater, there is an embodied sense where you have to have certain elements to make it a viable art form, right? And in it, you have a lot of power and a lot of strength, but you also have certain weaknesses that a mass distribution would not have. One of them, of course, is embodied action versus kind of a disembodied product, which my book has become this disembodied product that is sold on Amazon, which I never see who's reading it or who is responding to it or how they're reacting to it. So you need bodies, you need movement, you need language, you need something going on a stage with a collective audience. You are all here. You know each other, you have a community of people, you see each other. So that's an important part of what's going on in the theater. It's localized versus circulated, unmarketable. In Cuba, most tourists are not going to see the theater, either for linguistic reasons or because they'd rather see dance and music and other sorts of artistic performances in Cuba. So it is not a marketable art form, which affects very much what the motivations and the goals of the artists are, as well as how it fits in with the state and state institutions. Unpredictable, sometimes, right? It has the potential to be unpredictable, which makes it very powerful, especially in a place like Cuba, and public audiences, which I mentioned before. So as an anthropologist, part of what I have to do as a researcher is what's called ethnographic research, and it's qualitative and it's participant observation. So when I was doing my PhD, the rite of passage for anthropologists is to be there for at least a year, to be on the ground in the field. So the data is surrounding you. I had to be waiting in lines, I had to be paying my pesos and going and getting my bus ticket. I had to be doing all these things which were seemingly external to the research, but they were not at all. So in order to understand the artistic creation and the metaphors and the nuances within the performances of the theater, I had to also be physically experiencing that myself. And so that was a very important part of my research. This, however, dictated what kind of project I was going to choose. In Havana, for the first, my preliminary research over 2 years, it was about 6 months in total. And so what do you do when you're going to study theater? You go to see the theater. But in Cuba, this was 97, 98, and this was, during this special period in time of peace where things were better than they were in the early 90s, but still very difficult. Lots of apagones, blackouts, difficulties in transportation, fuel shortages, and so forth. So, here I am, I'm going to go see some theater. I would go to a theater, and it would be closed. It would be dark. I thought, well, on the list, there's a play tonight. Why isn't anything going on? And then I would go to the next theater. And so this became something that I had to start out a couple hours early, either walking or on a bike or in a colectivo, to try to find a play that was actually happening. Some of the reasons for why the plays would not or not be happening were that there was an apagon, and they would say, blackout, no hay tonight. Cartelera, there is once in a while a cartelera, which you can get at the places where they're selling the grandma and the newspapers and so forth, but only once in a while, and you have to get there really, really early before the 3 copies get sold out. So communication about the listing of when the performances were happening was not something that was ongoing. We look on Google, or we hear things, we have networks of communication, and in Havana that was not the case. So part of my experience was trekking around Havana trying to find a play to watch, and I also didn't know what was going on, so I would just hit every single theater to see if there was a play. Audience and actor transport. Those of you who have worked in Cuba know that it's very difficult to get around, and so you do have to wait for a long time for buses if the buses are going to show. So consider, if you're an actor, it's one thing, right? This is your job. This is something that you are paid to do. If you are an audience member and you have a couple of kids at home and you have to get to work in the morning, going to the show, you have to be incredibly persistent, which I was, but not many. I had a reason to be persistent. I was a graduate student. Sometimes there was no explanation, and other times you would meet the actors or the directors afterwards, and they would say, "Bueno, me compliqué." And this is this expression I love in Cuba. Me compliqué. And that's all you have to say. And maybe some of you have a good translation for this. My best translation was, things got complicated. Or I guess the literal translation is, I was hindered, which I really like. You can't pull that off in the United States. What did you say?
Something came up.
Something came up. Yeah. But it was serious enough, and nobody questions this, right? Me compliqué. So needless to say, this was not the place I could really do my research. And it was the theater in the 90s, the late 90s, was more conventional, analogies, kind of family dramas, comedies, and so forth. So what I discovered was, and I'll come back to that in a moment actually, that the forms of theater I really wanted to study were those that also used ethnographic research. So one of the classic theaters in Cuba is called Teatro Escambray, where in the 1968, late 60s, a lot of the very kind of high-level actors and directors and writers in Havana went out into the Escambray Mountains to bring theater to the people. And so theater was not to be an elitist form, it was to be a form that was accessible and that everybody could participate in, right? It was very much kind of a boal sort of theater of the oppressed, but not for rising up, rather to include people's voices in the artistic production of what it means to be Cuban. So I looked into some of these groups, and that is where I've been concentrating my research. Now, here are some of the reasons that the theater wouldn't happen in Havana. Some of the reasons that theater didn't happen while I was in Escambray and Guantanamo were because generators would run out. If you have one spotlight that is on a generator, or it is fueled by a lamp, if that's gone, there's no light. You can't do it at night. You have to wait till the morning, and people are at work in the morning. Hitchhiking, a lot of times the actors have to go to the performance space, which might just be a plaza or an open space, in botella. Sometimes it's fast, sometimes a truck comes by and you all hop in, sometimes 3 hours go by, 4 hours go by, and everybody's gone home at that point. You're not going to go to the place where the performance is because nobody will be there. One time we were rehearsing, this was in Dos Brazos in Guantanamo province, in one of the far-off caseríos, and it was rumored that the meat was arriving in the bodega. And so none of the actors or any of the audience wanted to go to the performance because the meat doesn't come very often in certain areas, well, even in Havana. So we were suspended 3 or 4 days because they were waiting for the meat to arrive in the bodega, and then we resumed rehearsals. They have to guard the animals from being stolen. If it rains, the places, the routes are too muddy and impassable. One time a machete cut one of the actors' hands, and I stepped in, and that was my debut, my acting debut at that point. Spider bites, trucks failing, not getting through, or the audience will get bored and walk away. So, none of this etiquette of sitting through a theater, maybe trying to sneak out at intermission. If you are in a certain area where you're sitting on the side of the hill with your horse and with your family, if you don't like it, you've got a lot of things to do. You just get up and you walk away. There's no, the rituals of theater going were very different in these areas that I was working in. So, although there are more reasons perhaps for why the theater would be closed, as an anthropologist, these were reasons that I could study and were very important and very interesting. Also, the areas where I was studying, the groups were all living together. I was living with the directors and with the actors and with the community itself. Therefore, if somebody wasn't going to show up, you just had to yell across the street and you would know that fulano no está hoy, right? And then you would be able to cancel it. So it was very much, for me, an important part of the research process. So Teatro Nuevo, just a little bit of background, I'm not sure how much theater background most of you have, but just like the Hombre Nuevo of the Revolution, we have a Teatro Nuevo, which was very much this Teatro Escambray, the including of the people in the theater scene, bringing the theater to the people instead of requiring them to go to the theater scenes. So 1968 was Teatro Escambray. Some of the offshoots, there were various others. Some of the more famous ones were Teatro Acero, done in a steel factory, and Teatro La Yaya, which was done in an area where they were also including the local people on stage, right? So the inclusion of the local people on stage, which was something of a revolution in that moment. What I was looking at then were the hijos, the children of this tradition. So very revolutionary theater, but in 1990s, during this special period in time of peace, it was a different sort of crisis. It was a different sort of challenge. And so the theater groups that embraced this, the legacy of Teatro Nuevo, were called Teatro Comunitario, kind of communitarian theater, professional theater groups who were taking the opportunity of this extreme scarcity and economic crisis to go out and bring theater to the people in a time where they really needed beauty and poetry and humor and some way to deal with a crisis that was otherwise people would not see the end of. There was no hasta cuando, right? There was no end to this crisis. So the theater was a very important thing. So I studied a group called Teatro de los Elementos and also La Cruzada Teatral, and I'll talk about those in just a moment. And the other offshoot of La Cruzada was called El Laboratorio de Teatro Comunitario. So here, I know you all know Cuba, but we have, I just want you to see kind of the boxed in areas are where I was working in relation to Havana. So if a lot of times when you're talking about Cuba, there is this kind of Cuba that is put out there, right? Cuba without qualification about which populations and which communities. And even though we have to, in order to actually have a coherent talk to, say, Cuba and Cubans, there is a big difference, especially when you're looking at cultural production and artistic production, among other things. So I was working for the first year in this kind of central region of the Escambray Mountains in a small town called Comayagua, which is where Los Elementos was, and they would then travel up into the mountains. And then the second region then is Guantanamo province. So it's someplace that was much more far away from Havana and therefore affected by state and state institutions in a very different way, or not at all. Here we have the Villa Clara Cienfuegos region, and you probably can't see it from there, but there are little theater masks for where the theater groups are located. One of them, you see I can't even point to it, but you see Cienfuegos, and then a little bit farther up, about an hour north, is Comayagua. A little bit farther, I guess, east would be Manacaragua, which is where Teatro Escambray was located. And then farther up, you'll see Teatro La Yaya. So those were a lot of these foundational groups that were using ethnographic methods to talk with the local people and devise plays to then perform back to them. So they were going to Havana to perform in festivals and to get high, elite criticisms and accolades. They were performing back to the people, so the dialogue was very important. Here are just some images. This is Macias, who is one of the prime informants of Los Elementos. Here again we have, this is Corina, she's in her bohío, her house. And these are some pictures of Jose Oriol Gonzalez, who is the director of Los Elementos, and one of the scenes in Comayagua on the theater stage. So they went up to an area called Siguanea Amavenia, and they did research with the local campesinos, found out what the metaphors, what stories they were telling about themselves, put it into a play, and then performed it back to the people of the area, as well as they did go to Havana with that one, actually. And that was called Te mi nombre como un sueño, which was a verse from one of the decimas that the campesinos had sung for the group. Okay, so the second year that I was there, I was in Guantanamo province, far away from the base. I guess I don't have to say that to this group, but in the mountain regions of Guantanamo province. And again, like, you can't really see it too much from the distance, but you see a little truck down below that says La Cruzada Teatral, and then the little dots are locating the route that the group took throughout the mountains. Some of those were in this kind of, we were all loaded with props and sets and actors and everybody else bedding in the back of the truck, going and then stopping in several locations each day, performing for schools during the day and then the population at night. And here are some images then again of Guantanamo. These are some of the audience. These are the people the community members who were in these areas. You see a little impromptu pelea de gallo. And this is a corrida de cinta, which is one of the events that the campesinos would do when they had the time. The other offshoot of that is called El Laboratorio, the Laboratorio Teatro Comunitario. And this is, Uri Gonzalez is the director. He's there holding a script with one of the campesino actors who's on horseback. So the horses and the children and everybody else were included in the performance. And this was about the loss of identity. And a lot of these plays were about this crisis, right? What happens when you don't know what Cuban is anymore? In the 1990s, you no longer are talking about Marx and socialismo or muerte, but you are talking about being a revolutionary. So you have, one of the things I wanted to mention here is that state is not the word really that's said in the arts. It's more, are you a revolutionary or not? Is the art revolucionario, or is it something that is going in a different direction, right? So there is, Estado was something that had more to do with resources and regulations and rules, and less to do with the development of an artistic image. This is the play that they produced called El Guajiro a los Cuatro Vientos. So it had to do with what it means to be a Guajiro after socialism. So not pre-revolutionary Guajiros, but a Guajiro or a campesino who is a pura cepa, right, from the land, uncontaminated. There's the idea of purity, not contaminated by commercialism, profit, foreigners, in these kind of commercialized areas where people were selling out. So very much this idea of the campesinos being a representation of what was still good and pure about Cuba, but coupled with education and cultivation, right? So this desire to cultivar and to bring culture to these people who did not have culture was still part of the intention of the groups. So the back and forth between what is pure Cuban, what is pure campesino, what is the good, where are we going now, right? It's not about, yes, we're still revolutionary, yes, we are still socialist, but we have to find something else that comes that is performing ourselves as Cuban. And the artists were part and parcel of this development, part and parcel of the dialogue. Here's another scene of El Guajiro. This is the set, made in a big plaza. The nails to put together the set were borrowed from one of the local campesinos' houses and had to be put back when the play was done. So one of the things I want to talk about is how, in terms of the state, right? How do theater groups feel the state? How do they experience the state? It's not, we can't just look. I live in Washington, D.C. now. Their state is everywhere. You can go downtown and there's the state, right? When you're in Havana, you have the Capitolio, you have the National Theater, you have festivals, you have conferences, you have Plaza de Revolucion, you have very architecturally grand vestiges of the state. And you have cultural officials who are going to the theaters and going to watch things. So the presence is in people, it's in the CDR, it's in every part of the structure. You feel it much more so in the center, in Havana. When you go into the rural areas, feeling the state becomes different. It's a different sort of imagination of the state and experience of the state. One of those is in the official rules. Is the bus going to come to take us to the plaza? Are we going to get money? Are they going to replace the light bulbs, right? Can we do this play or can we not do this play? But also in the narratives and the metaphors that are used. La lucha, revolución, pura cepa. These things are also, where are these metaphors and where are these narratives coming from? And to what extent were the actors willing to depart from them? Being near or far, being part of the periphery, not Havana not being your central point, United States not being your central point, but rather in Guantanamo, Haiti and Dominican Republic, the rest of the Caribbean and the rest of Latin America being much more where the influences are coming from. Havana is allá, and the United States is más allá. Right? So it's a different sort of perspective. So perspective and space and distance is very important. Also attention and neglect. In Guantanamo, the biggest feeling of the state was that they were neglecting Guantanamo. Guantanamo is not a tourist destination. There's nothing beautiful there. It's a small town by our kind of city standards. There was a lot of neglect and just ignoring of them. So an actor went up for promotion. There's levels of actors, 1, 2, 3, 4. If an actor had an audition, and they would prepare, and the official from Havana was supposed to come and knock them up a notch or not, the official just wouldn't show up. Because Guantanamo, there's a lot of, this kind of idea of Oriente y Occidente, and that conflict was very present in their experience of what state was. I think I'm running out of time, so cut me off, I'll wrap this up. And also just a couple of images here of space, because space is also a very important thing in terms of performance space and audience space. Here we have some musicians. This is in Guantanamo in Dos Brazos, and they're rehearsing for the play they're going to be performing for. And you see kind of a classic bohío in the background. And then we have Juanes, right, performing in Havana with microphones and security, and everything is mediatized, international recognition for this concert. 1 million people, it is said, in the audience. And also a salsa club, in Havana, which you have to pay for in divisas, or cooks, I guess, nowadays, less than divisas. So here's the audience this is an Escambray audience. This is Cuatro Vientos. So they're all hanging out watching the performance. And of course, here's your audience space in Havana, in Hazard. This is not a typical theater audience space, but I want you to kind of think about the different experience that you have. Here you have an anonymous audience, unless you're caught on video someplace. And the previous one, this is not anonymous at all. So if you get up and walk away, that's a statement, right? And the actors know that you're getting up and walking away. So different sorts of experience of control and regulation. My work then was looking very much at in the 90s and in the early 2000s, how these rural artists, and if you can think about, you're all New Yorkers, or you're in New York right now, you have Broadway, you have a very high-level theater scene in the city. If you were an actor who worked in Oklahoma, right, there's a feeling of not being a high-level actor or artist unless you make it in a certain area, right? So in Cuba, a similar sort of relationship was happening. So for the first time in the late 90s and early 2000s, these rural artists had a voice of cultural authority because they were closer to the Pura Cepa of Cubanía, right? They were closer to a culture that the Havana people could not touch, and that was being increasingly supported by the state. So a lot of these theater groups were being funded, much more so than they were before, which means there was an increase in these sorts of groups. And the narrative there was about rescuing identity. It was about the Pura Cepa and fighting pseudo-culture, which was the so-called contaminated culture in the city. And that included artistic production, music, dance, theater. So I'll just conclude this. One of the things that I have been studying mostly throughout my time is you have culture and state, right? But you also have the theater and the people, and the dialogue is not just back and forth. When I first began my research, I was looking at citizen and state, right? These were my categories, my dichotomy that I was going to start my research with. But when you go, and in the time that I was working in Cuba, there are cultural meetings, there are culture workers, there are artists. You have festivals, you have theoretical events, you have performances. And so in the creative process, which lasts for a month, you have meetings of all of the artists coming together, and you have state officials there. So the dialogue is not one back and forth, but rather the people are talking to the artists are talking to the people, the artist talking to the state is talking back to all this, and this is an ongoing, dynamic, circular, zigzagging process, right? And this is the potential of theater, is that it's generative, that ideas and identity are being generated and moving forward continually. There is no hasta or after or what happens when. This is an ongoing, continuing process that is always reverting back into history and always looking into the future as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
So tonight I will speak speak about the curatorial practices in Cuba, and this is a preliminary summary of my current research on the subject, as well as on my own experience as a curator for over a decade in Havana, both working within the institutional framework and as a freelance curator. As Rafael mentioned, after I graduated, I went to work at the Lubitsch Foundation of Cuba. It's a non-for-profit independent organization. At the same time, I was related as an assistant professor at the Higher Institute of Art, which was a great thing because on the one hand, we were organizing exhibitions, and on the other, I was in touch with the newest generations that were being formed at the Higher Institute of Arts. So curating is about making visible or highlighting certain issues, ideas, and concerns. By selecting a group of artworks according to their meaning as part of a curatorial statement, the curator is exercising symbolic power. He's saying, I find this interesting and I would like to show it to you. The curator also needs to regard the platform from which this statement is made. She or he is the facilitator for an encounter between the art and the public, which is often determined by the site where this encounter takes place, be it a white cube gallery, a magazine, or the street. The what, how, and for whom questions in the title are aspects of the curatorial practice that we need to take into account in order to assess its effectiveness. However, as we will see in this presentation, these basic questions become somewhat complicated and even twisted when we look at these dynamics during the last decade in Cuba. We will see that although the government provides a rigid institutional structure, its mechanism of control has suffered from the economic paralysis, and this has opened up some loopholes that artists and curators have consistently exploited. A challenging aspect for a curator working in Cuba and making use of the system of institutions and galleries, all run by the state, is that the what, the how, and the for whom should subordinate to a cultural policy of the state and the government that covers every aspect of cultural production and is preliminarily based on ideology. I mean, primarily based on ideology. To explain this, I have imagined a huge strainer or filter, and I have to give credit to Elvis Fuentes and Pavel Acosta, who helped me make this drawing. So in this diagram, we find the Council of State at the very bottom, followed by the Ministry of Culture, which, and I quote from their website, directs, orients, controls, and executes the cultural policy throughout a number of state institutions. So, subordinated to the State Council, we have the Ministry of Culture that is directing, orienting, controlling, executing this cultural policy throughout a number of state institutions. Although not in this sketch, this structure includes every sector related to arts, from art education to art production to the system of exhibitions on the art market. These instances ramify in all directions to affect the furthest local communities in every corner of the island. Then we have the National Council for the Visual Arts that is subordinated to the Ministry of Culture and has established a system of recognition through a curatorship award, founded in 2000, which prizes the best exhibitions realized in the previous year. And there is also a curatorship award for an exhibition to come, granted by the National Union of Artists and Writers, UNIAC. Potential awardees are meant to be Cuba-based curators. So if you are a foreigner coming to make an exhibition in Cuba, or if you are a Cuban living somewhere else, you're not considered for these awards. The National Council of the Visual Arts also revises and approves the schedule of events of the contemporary arts institutions in the city. For example, it okays the list of artisan works participating in the Contemporary Cuban Art Salons, which is one of the most important events that happens every year in the city, and also co-organizes the Havana Biennial together with the Wilfredo Lam Center. However, this training system, this filtering system, has become dysfunctional over the years. There is an internal exhaustion and carelessness, mainly because of the financial crisis these institutions are going through. The functionaries who are supposed to keep the structure working are most of the time more concerned with finding alternative sources of income and fighting the daily hardships of the lack of resources, transportation, and incentives. This is why it is possible to find instances in which it appears that the system fails to exercise control. And this is the case of the project Tatlin's Whispered, number 6, Havana version by Tania Bruguera. This piece was presented at the Wilfredo Lam Center during the 10th Havana Biennial. Bruguera negotiated granting 1 minute of total freedom to anybody who wanted to take the floor in this tribune, while a young man and woman dressed in military uniform placed a white dove in the speaker's shoulder. The scene was a continuous reenactment of the inaugural speech of Fidel Castro in Havana when a white dove landed on his shoulder. This incident, which spontaneity had been doubt, was interpreted as a divine message within a very religious population at that time. Among the speakers in Bruguera's piece were different bloggers, including famous Generation Y's Joanny Sanchez, who called out for freedom of information and other human rights in Cuba, not only in front of the national and international press, but also in front of a local public for whom such a situation has been unimagined for half a century. The Havana Biennials cannot be overlooked when reflecting about curating in Cuba, not only for the significance of the main event itself, but also because this time of international reunion of the art world in Havana triggers many other satellite projects in the city. The event itself, founded in 1984, has attracted international attention because of its specialization on areas hardly represented in other mega events historically. It focuses on contemporary art from Africa, the Middle East, Asia, Latin American, and the Caribbean. Anyhow, with honorable exceptions, the curatorial selection on these days is back to recycling the same names one finds in in any other biennial in the world. And one of the reasons why this happens is that Wilfredo Lam Center, of course, cannot afford most of the research trips necessary to keep freshening these kind of proposals. The biennial has lost a great deal of international financial support in comparison with former years. Its fixed team of curators has to deal not only with a tight financial framework, but also with the frameworks imposed by a rigid cultural policy. In the meantime, other international projects now have found similar interests than the Havana Biennial in the world. Gasworks and the Triangular Straws in the United Kingdom, for instance, have established a system of artistic residences throughout the world that facilitate the encounters between young curators and artists from all over the world, including Africa, Asia, Latin America. And they have also landed in Cuba in the form of an exchange program of residences called Batiscafo. Out of these exchanges, many independent projects have been both developed in Cuba and abroad, which have turned out to be far more interesting than the curatorial premises of the biennial at this point. Nevertheless, during the time of the Havana Biennial, the city becomes the playground for several international opportunities and art market transactions, especially for Cuban artists. Most of these take place within a lively scene outside the institutions. This is the time of year when all the artists who were traveling and are not that interested anymore in exhibiting in Havana would come back home. It is also the time to make sure, it is also the time to make use of their entrepreneurial skills and create spaces of their own in the city where to receive potential buyers, curators, or galleries, led by local tour guides, curators, and art critics who receive a percent from any sale taking place at this time. During the last Havana Biennial, Sandra Ceballos, director of the alternative project Aglutinador Laboratorio, pushed and published a program of exhibitions that pose an alternative to those focused in exporting art. Artworks were shown in houses and other spaces of the city, such as a local stand to sell potatoes, as you can see in the invitation postcard. All of these will be open alongside the main event, alongside the biennial. The Aglutinador project, first called Espacio Aglutinador, and currently on its second phase, called Aglutinador Laboratory, was founded by artists Sandra Ceballos and Ezequiel Suarez in 1994, and it's the oldest alternative curatorial project in the island that has become a symbol of resistance to Cuba's cultural status quo. Within the premises of Ceballos House, many exhibitions, projects, and events take place involving an impressive list of both national and international artists, curators, and critics, and this has been like that along the years. This project has become a counterpart to the elitist and commercial art circuit in the island, in spite of the many attempts of the government to boycott it. Espacio Aglutinador was the first and only institution who, for example, dared to show Cuban artist Ángel Delgado's work after coming out of prison for defecating on Cuba's official newspaper, and this is something you might have heard of. So after he was out of jail, of course, no institution wanted to show his work, and I think it was very brave at that time to make an exhibition of the works that he did in prison, for example. A history of consequent and intransigent responses to issues related to art and culture in Cuba has gained them great credibility and respect. Sandra Ceballos' recent project, the Museum of Maniac Art, or MAM, as it stands for in Spanish, Museo de Arte Maniaco, is the first private museum opened in Cuba since the triumph of the revolution, and already counts with 227 works that were part of Ceballos' own collection. It focuses on a very specific sector of this alternative art scene in the island, which she describes in a kind of manifesto or declaration as a combination between outsider art and the art of self-taught artists. But ultimately, every work that breathes a disturbing, perceptive, almost extrasensorial atmosphere that expresses pain, disequilibrium, contradictions, crudeness, insecurity, experimentation, doubt, fear, haughtiness. Ceballos is looking forward to make the collection grow and itinerate. She has also allocated some of the funds of this project and Aglutinador Laboratorio to develop a residency program and another curatorship award. The auction Perra Subasta, or Bitch Auction, is an alternative to the official Subasta Habana. Some news is that international institutions such as the Prince Claus Fund, which in the year 2000 was granted the sum of 90,000 euros to the Havana Biennial, has now relocated their budget into initiatives like this in the city. While Ceballos' museum is the result of a long curatorial process starting in the 90s, Some other alternative spaces in the city pop out temporarily, lasting for a couple of years sometimes and then disappearing. Some others have existed for a long period of time but haven't kept a systematic program of events. Ceballos discusses the experience of being an artist who became a curator and converted her house into a gallery in an interview with art critic Suzette Sanchez, and I quote, "We know that doing this means sacrificing privacy, confronting lacerating situations such as having your personal work banned and even prohibited by the institutions, receiving a subpoena to attend these places where they try to persuade you or warn you, and it is also dealing with economic scarcities." Cristo Salvador Galleria was in the list of alternative spaces suggested by Ceballos during the last biennial, and one of those you hear the most on these days. It is a gallery run by artist Otario Oliva in his apartment in the Vedado neighborhood. Oliva creates a symbolic religious frame through the title and certain graphic elements in the design of the invitations, which are pretty close one another. Anyhow, the curatorial idea is far from suggesting any kind of religious sectarianism, as inferred from the use of the most buried crosses that sometimes become X's. He emphasizes the spiritual, non-material aspect of art as opposed to the market-driven context of official art in Cuba. There is an antecedent in the work of the mid-90s of Esterio Segura, who appropriated the Catholic imagery to speak about the marginal condition of religious practices and himself within the Cuban society. Segura's projects, of course, preceded the visit of the Pope in 1998, after which Catholicism has gained some ground in the Cuban mainstream. In the slide, there are also images of Cristo Salvador's most recent project. It was an exhibition by Cuban American artists Jan Moreno and Ernesto Rosa that had to do with cultural resistance. So I wanted to show you how the setting was at one of these private spaces. The space of Linea 106 is the house and studio of artists Alfredo Ramos and Katarzyna Badash. Although not offering a regular program, they have been organizing exhibitions here for many years, through which they have gained visibility within the art scene in Havana. Together with Ceballos, Ramos curated Mind's first phase, which was sponsored by the Museum of Maniac Art, and it tells you how a network is starting to be built among these alternative spaces. Riera Studio, run by printmaker Samuel Riera, is a project oriented to outsider art, this time closer to doing communitarian work. As in the cases mentioned above, the exhibition space is no other than the house of the artist, and curatorships are thought for a home setting. Anyhow, in Riera Studio, artworks coexist with ordinary life objects, while his family keeps on with their daily routines in the house. During the 10th Havana Biennial, Riera announced an art sale a precio de bodega, or at bodega prices, meaning very affordable prices in Cuban pesos, those of the ration card products in the neighborhood market, so really inexpensive, which contrasts with the current prohibited prices for food and also for Cuban art. A call was made for both artists willing to sell their works at these symbolic prices and potential buyers. The absurdity of such improbable exchange highlighted the current mismatch between contemporary art and society at all levels. Even when the alternative scene in Cuba today is given to horizontal collaborations and dialogue, it is well divided in many communities of friends and contacts with specific interests. Sometimes many of these exhibitions include, of course, the organizers, it's their house, so they throw in an art piece. So it's more kind of friends situation and context. Another protagonist group within the alternative scene in Havana is that of artists who are mainly influenced by the different trends of the Higher Institute of Art education, or those who are at least close to the specific kind of questions this institution has brought up in the last decade. This group is not only revising the structure of the art system in Cuba, but also posing questions regarding the very nature of their artistic practice. They are rethinking the traditional forms of education, production, and circulation of the artworks, and therefore sometimes exhibiting in an alternative gallery is not alternative enough for this kind of practice. One of the projects that undoubtedly influenced these trends is the DUP Gallery, coming out of the Higher Institute of Arts. DUP stands for Based on Pedagogic Pragmatics in Spanish. It is a pedagogic initiative funded by René Francisco Rodriguez, professor at the Higher Institute of Arts, which has had several editions. Every event DUP has organized has offered a curatorial framework from which to launch the individual work of each of its members. In a 2005 interview, one of its artists explains, and I quote, "The term gallery emphasizes that although we are stressing the collective, we nevertheless greatly respect the individual, currently the only thing that a collective project can support." The image belongs, well, you see, I was glad I found this picture of the whole group, because nowadays you see many of these artists having a very strong individual practice. So I was glad to see how young they were at that time. Maybe you recognize some. So the image below belongs to an event called Desde un Pensar Abstraído, or something like From an Abstracted Thought. Artists intervened sidewalk tiles from the 60s, designed by Cuban abstract painters in La Rampa, a centric neighborhood in Havana. Abstraction was victim of institutional oblivion since the revolution, when figurative languages in art were prioritized. The idea was to rethink abstraction in a moment when Cuban art was so much oriented towards figuration again. A younger generation of artists who started to come out of the art school approximately 5 or 6 years ago takes the idea of collaboration into broader directions. Fidel Garcia, for example, involves in his artistic processes engineers, statesmen, philosophers, hackers, to create a multidisciplinary work that results in complicated homemade technology. In T-Error, Garcia connects an intricate set of antennas to a laptop and sensors of movement. The whole structure is activated by the curious visitors when approaching the piece. T-Error creates a field of energy that interferes the main local radio station, providing citizens with national and international news. Garcia's goal is to create an area that is free of the contamination of the media, which he believes is very biased in Cuba. In Vigilia, Wakefulness, 2005, Adrian Melis makes use of his friendship with the night watchman of a state carpentry in the city of Havana in order to illegally buy wooden slabs during several months. Once he collected enough wood, he would then use it to build a hut for these watchmen, who had to spend the night outdoors to carry out their job. Humanitarian Aid has been a very polemic piece by Spanish artist Nuria Well. About the same age of the artists in this generation, in her early 30s now, Well lived in Cuba for several years while studying at the Higher Institute of Arts. She launched a national contest of love letters, which were to be addressed to her. The prize consisted in marrying her and being able to legally migrate to Spain. The piece is now completed. After marrying the winner and traveling together to Spain, this union, which was never sexual, dissolved once her husband became a Spanish citizen. Another outcome of this work is the publication of the collection of 33 love letters sent from all over the country to this lovable woman stranger who offered the chance to solve the most urgent problems in life to a truly romantic man. The piece becomes a reflection on the use and abuse of love, as well as on the dynamics of life and the values in the island nowadays. Well, on the other hand, reverse the traditional practice of Spanish single men targeting Cuban women to find true love. The examples above express in different ways Tania Bruguera's concept of behavior art. A great number of artists in this generation were part of her behavior art workshop, an alternative educational project in Havana that made emphasis in the social responsibility of the artist while revolutionizing the way to approach the medium of performance and other non-objectual practices. The very nature of their work demands a level of eccentricity in relation to the institutional apparatus. And this is one of the events at Tania Bruguera's Cátedra de Arte de Conducta or Behavior Art workshops. So within this formula, the initial questions of what, how, and to whom do not apply either, as many of the artworks carry their own system of references. They are time and site specific or relay in the interaction with specialists from other fields of knowledge. Most of the time, curators, especially from state institutions, have a hard time finding the tools to approach and understand the very specific demands of these works. In other instances, curators also suffer backlashes from getting involved in projects that try to go beyond what is sanctioned by the Cuban mainstream institution. An example of this can be seen in my own work, and I thought I'm going to talk about something I have done. Well, it has happened in repeated occasions. My curatorial project, Conjunto Steel Salmons, which won the National Curatorship Award from the National Union of Artists and Writers, UNIAC, in 2004, was cancelled because it included Albanian artists, and Cuba had no diplomatic relations with this country. That was it. As well, in 2007, when I co-curated with Elvis and Alexis Novoa, Killing Time, that was presented here in New York at Exit Art. Well, the project included artists from the island and the exiled community, and some of the work made political comments whose effectiveness was enough to cancel every other project of mine that was planned later that year in state institutions. So these experiences made me develop the concept of invisible curatorships as a site-specific project for Havana. Since 2008, I realized multiple collaborations with some of the artists that I had shown here today. For instance, T-Error by Fidel Garcia, the field of antennas that would interfere with the radio. We did in one of these curatorships. And also this piece, Bomba Lógica, or Logic Bomb, which was his project for his MFA thesis at the Ejército of Art. Garcia intervened the short frequency radio station used by police in Old Havana, where the piece was shown, as well as the surveillance camera near the gallery to provide that collected information to the gallery goers in real time. So he inverted this structure of control. Just like I did, many other artists and curators have operated in the margins of the Cuban institutional system, which has failed to flexibilize their policies in order to make room for the new generation of artists. This is probably because of the fear to face other episodes that make obvious their inability to control meaning. And remember what happened with Tania Bruguera's work during the biennial and having, Giovanni Sanchez coming and making a speech. So, however, Cuban authorities' obsession for control over meaning faces new challenges as they embark on projects in the international art scene. For example, in this review of the Cuban Pavilion, at the Venice Biennial, the writer misunderstood what was an official exhibition curated by the director of the Havana Biennial, who happens to be the director of the Wilfred Center, as a project with almost dissident overtones, and that's what the article says. So I hope that the curator Jorge Fernandez now doesn't need to go underground and start making his own invisible curatorships. Thank you.